Good morning and welcome in our new lecture entitled The Haccp System. In this lecture, we'll determine some keywords of the Haccp. We will better understand the purpose of a Haccp system. We will define the CCP, how Haccp can assist food industries, and we will recall the 7 principles in the Haccp process. I will start with some keywords in the Haccp system. Control measure is any action or activity that can eliminate the food safety hazard to an acceptable level, such as measuring foreign bodies in chickpeas. Corrective action is an action that will avoid the recurrence of a certain problem. CCP is a step that which control should be applied to prevent or eliminate the food safety hazard to an acceptable level, such as pasteurization temperature. Critical limit is the temperature itself that separates acceptability from unacceptability. Deviation is when we fail to meet a critical limit. Flow diagram is the flow chart stating all the steps from farm to fork. Haccp is the system itself that identifies, evaluates, and controls hazards. Hazard is any agent that could be physical, biological, or chemical that can contaminate the food to make it unsafe. Monitoring is when we do some measurement and observation to control whether a CCP is being controlled. Validation is to make sure that all the steps applied by the Haccp system are fulfilled. So HACCP stands for Hazard is a danger to health, Analysis is the investigation of the hazard, Critical is crucial for the containment, Control is with the handling of the conditions, Endpoint is the position at the flow chart where we need to implement the HACCP. So basically, traditionally, the industries and the food processors, they tend to adopt systems being reactive rather than being preventive. So mainly, they wait to face the problem and to start to put in place correction to react to the problem, okay? But basically, these systems were demonstrated to be less efficient than the new system introduced, which is the HACCP system. So HACCP system is a proactive system, mainly relying on preventive measure rather than relying on corrective measures. So to differentiate between corrective measure, and preventive measure, correction is the step that you take directly in order to solve the problem. For example, let's say that the temperature of the chiller was not 1 to 4. I was monitoring the temperature of the chiller and I figured out that the temperature is around 20. As the first step of correction, I need to remove all the food products from the chiller and put them in a backup chiller. As a corrective measure, so here definitely the corrective measure is the measure that I will take in place in order to avoid the recurrence of the problem. So to avoid to face the same problem again, I need to put in place a procedure mainly relying on preventive maintenance to make sure that every single morning the maintenance department is checking if the chiller is working properly. So preventive measure is when you do not face the problem. So when you are dealing with a problem for the first time and you want to avoid the occurrence of the problem. So mainly it could be based on as well the expertise from other industries. So what is a HACCP system? It's a science-based internationally accepted food safety system focusing mainly on identifying the hazards and preventing them. It addresses all the chemical, biological, and physical hazards and can be applied to any segment of the food chain from farm to fork. So it's a farm-to-table continuum, farm-to-table concept where we need to ensure that the food is safe all throughout the food chain. HACCP system has many objectives, starting with the prevention of foodborne illnesses and consequently foodborne outbreaks, to reduce the losses due to product recall, to protect the reputation of the food industries, and to reduce the cost of food analysis. HACCP system has as well many benefits. The first priority of benefits is to ensure that the food is safe, is to enhance the international trade throughout the market access, to protect against liability, to improve continuously the food service establishment and food industries, and to enhance the process control. Additionally, HACCP system has more advantages. For example, using the approach of controlling the critical control points to prevent food safety problems, to reduce the reliance on end product inspection, and basically to use traceability system to go back in the process from the raw materials to check the point of problem occurrence. So, also, if I want to cite some advantages, is that it can be applied from the primary producer to the consumer, and it saves the industries the cost of destroying product, and many other types of costs. However, HACCP system has some barriers Top one barrier is the lack of government commitment. So basically, in some countries, the government does not support either financially or even consultancy-wise the HACCP implementation. Absence of legal requirements. For example, in Lebanon, plenty of products do not have Lebanon standard, and if the product has no standard, automatically we cannot export the product because we don't have like a reference to check whether the product is conform or non-conform. Financial constraints, since HACCP implementation is costly, implementation-wise, infrastructure-wise, as well as consultancy-wise and expertise. HR constraints, sometimes we do not have manpower enough educated to fulfill the requirement of the HACCP. Lack of expertise, because in some food commodities we don't have expertise in Lebanon. Inadequate infrastructure and facilities, especially with respect if the industry is too old and does not have a facility able to fulfill the requirement of the HACCP. And inadequate communication, whether internally with Lebanon, with the ministries, or externally with other countries, such as FDA or EFSA, European Food Safety Authority. So where HACCP can be used in the production, in the processing, and the transportation, and even in the retail and food service. So HACCP is a part of the ISO 22000. ISO 22000, it's an international standard standing for the food safety management system. So ISO 22000 is basically equality and safety standard at the same time. It's composed of four different elements based on interactive communication. It's a system management, so it's based on PRPs. We'll talk later on about the PRPs and on HACCP principles. So HACCP principles plus ISO 9001 will give us the ISO 22000, which is the food safety management system. To implement the HACCP, we need all this time to start with the PRPs, the prerequisite, which is the basis of any kind of food industries, mainly based on the infrastructure, on the pest control, on the GHPs, on the GMPs, and then followed by the 7 principles of HACCP in action. So to implement HACCP, we have a logical sequence for the application, mainly composed of 12 steps. The key step is first of all to assemble the HACCP team. So the HACCP team should be a multidisciplinary team. So the second step should be describing the product itself. The third is to identify the intended use. The fourth is to trace the flow diagram, and then the fifth step mainly is composed of non-site confirmation of the flow diagram. The sixth is started by analyzing the hazards, biological, chemical, physical, and every single step. The seventh step is to determine the CCPs. The step number 8 is to establish critical limits for every single CCP. Step number 9 is to establish monitoring system for the CCPs. Number 10, to establish corrective action. And 11, to put in place verification procedure, to end up with the step number 12, to establish documentation and record keeping. So HACCP system is composed of 14 steps, okay, starting also by defining the terms reference such as the key terms that I already explained, and reviewing the HACCP plan as the last step. But it's composed of 7 principles, okay. So the 7 principles are: principle number 1, to carry out hazard analysis; number 2, to identify the critical control points; number 3, to establish critical limits; number 4, to identify monitoring procedures; and number 5, establishing corrective actions; 6, writing procedure and instructions; and 7, verification system. So step number 1, assembling the HACCP team. HACCP team should be a multidisciplinary team. So usually it should be headed by the food safety team leader, and in the team we should have representative from every single department. So let's consider that we are in the canning industry. So basically the HACCP team should be headed by the food safety team leader, which is most of the case the quality manager, okay? So as well in the HACCP team, we can find a representative from the production department, a representative from the sales department, because the sales department will mainly get the feedback from the market. So the sales department will give us some input to continuously improve the HACCP implementation. We should have as well from the purchasing department a representative, because the purchasing officer should be all the time involved in the HACCP implementation and the standard, because he will mainly deal with the suppliers to check whether the raw materials will be conform or not to the reference standard in the industry. Okay, a representative as well from the HR to make sure to deal with the manpower, with the GHP of the manpower, and to put in place some sanctions in case they will violate the good hygienic practices in the industry. We can have as well a representative from the warehouses, a warehouse keeper, to check the storage, good storage conditions and operations. And it depends on the industry. We can have as well a representative from the maintenance department to make sure that they are abiding by preventive maintenance steps. So the HACCP team should be a multidisciplinary HACCP team. They need to have info and knowledge about the raw materials, about the quality assurance. They need to be involved in the operational activities of the HACCP, even engineering, equipment, technical knowledge. So basically, with respect to the maintenance department. So with the process, they need to be familiar with the process, with the end product, with the hazard analysis, and with the environment, mainly such as the premises, properties, and surroundings. So assembling the HACCP team, so it should include a HACCP trained person, which should be the head of the HACCP team. And the HACCP team will oversee the implementation and maintenance of the HACCP program. So make sure that we should never start the HACCP implementation before making sure that the PRPs are ready. Okay, so describing the product is the step number one to put in place product description. So while describing the product, we should form like a product description. It's like a form that should be filled where we need to put in it the product name, the composition, the end product characteristic, what are the methods of preservation, the packaging, whether it's primary, the packaging shipping, the storage condition, distribution method, the shelf life of the product, special labeling, and customer preparation. So in the description of the product, we can put as well some biological, chemical, and physical characteristic, how it will be prepared, where it will be sold. For example, if you the example of frozen cooked peeled shrimp, that is the product name. The source of the raw material is locally a product. Import and product characteristic, we can say that the temperature should be less than -18. The ingredients are shrimp, glaze, salt, and water. The packaging is a PE polyethylene bag, 300 grams and 1200 grams. How the end product is to be used, so it should be thawed and normally consumed within further cooking. The shelf life is 6 months after packaging. Where the product will be sold, domestic retail, international market, high-risk consumer group, special labeling instruction. So it depends on the FDA if we are in US and the Lebanon if we are in Lebanon. It should be kept to frozen, and special distribution for control shelf life, it should be distributed at -18. So I will communicate with you as well. I will upload a product description. I will upload a full HACCP implementation so that you can be familiar with the HACCP implementation. So as I already said, a full description including physical and chemical structure, including water activity and pH, some static treatments such as heat treatment, freezing, binding, packaging, durability, and storage conditions. So identify the intended use. Intended use should be identified as well during the HACCP implementation. It should be based on the expected use of the product by the end user or consumer. For example, we have basically 5 sensitive groups that we need to emphasize on in this tab. For example, if people can have some allergy towards this product. For example, if you are producing chocolate with peanuts and plain chocolate, so it could be if you are producing on the same line that the plain chocolate could contain traces of peanuts. So that's why I need to emphasize on this while implementing the HACCP. And keep in mind that we have mainly 5 sensitive groups in the population, such as elderly, infants, pregnant, sick, and immunocompromised. Consider flow diagram. So simply you have to trace the flow chart, passing by every single step. So let's say that I'm preparing tomato paste. So usually the first step should be what? The first step should be the import of the raw materials. For example, the tomato concentrate itself, the citric acid if I'm adding starch, some citric acid, the starch if I'm adding starch, the salt if I'm adding salt. So it's just like you put every single raw material aside together as well in parallel with the packages. For example, you put the jars, you put caps, you put the water, and the water should be definitely treated. The second step will be, for example, the mixing of the different ingredients, and we need to specify the mixing temperature and the mixing time. Following the mixing, maybe we can preheat the product by heat exchange. So we can put preheating in heat exchanger. Then we will pass to the filling step. Filling step, if it's a hot filling, so you need to also to mention the filling temperature. So it depends. You can, for example, in the tomato paste products, you can either pasteurize the whole product itself in the mixing tank, and then you fill the product hot filling, and you cap it and you package it, or simply you can only mix at high temperature, but you do not pasteurize at this step. You pasteurize the end product after filling the product. Okay, so let's say that about the second scenario. So the second scenario again, so raw materials mixing at a high temperature, after mixing preheating, after preheating hot filling. So we hot fill in the jars. The jars should be definitely pre-sterilized with hot steam. Okay, after the hot filling we need to in the flow chart all the time you should mention temperature and time. So we hot fill. After hot filling steaming, we steam, okay, then all the jars will enter into ethanol, a kind of a pasteurizer, where the temperature will be elevated, will increase to reach like 90 degree for almost like 15 minutes, and then followed by a cooling step. Though the cooling should be at a temperature of 1 to 4. Why do we cool the product? We cool the product to avoid putting it in a danger zone. So usually we cool by spraying or flashing cold water, okay, and then after the cooling, okay, usually we should have a dryer to remove the residues of water. So after the dryer, we just inkjet the production expiry date, and then we put them in trays. We wrap them packages in packages, okay, or in trays and boxes. It depends. And then storage, we can store them, okay. Or we can dispatch them directly. So this is the flow diagram. It should be constructed, and a flow diagram is the following step. It should be verified, because basically if you don't verify the flow chart, if you have any missing step, it will bias all the HACCP implementation. So you need to make sure that every single step in your flow chart is fully conform to what's happening on the floor. And you can verify your flow chart simply by taking the flow chart, going on the floor, making sure that every single step is being implemented, checking with the food handlers, with the manpower, asking questions to make sure whether they are fulfilling or not the steps of the flow diagram. So validate the process flow diagram by the HACCP team. We need to observe the process flow. We need to take samples to make sure that, okay, the sample is fulfilling the flow chart. We need to make some interviews on site to make sure that everything is happening according to the flow chart. Okay, and we need to differentiate between the routine operations from the non-routine, because sometimes the flowchart is the routine one, but for X reason, the manpower, they can shift and they can make some deviation in the flowchart. So we need to make sure that they are abiding fully and 100% by what is being declared on the flowchart. Step number 6 is literally the first real step of analyzing the hazards. So in this step, we need to take every single step of the flowchart that I already explained, and we need to make sure that we should put the physical, biological, and chemical hazards. For example, if I'm talking about step number 1 in the tomato paste, so tomato paste receiving, what kind of physical hazard I might have in tomato paste? I might have, for example, uh, uh, leaves or skins from the tomato physically wise. Chemically wise, I might have some pesticide residues, and biologically wise, I can have a heavy load of, let's say, E. coli if the tomato has been washed with water contaminated with sewage. Okay, so this is the hazard analysis at every single step of every single stage of the flow chart. I need to do the same. Okay, so I will post you on Moodle as well some examples of hazard analysis. Okay, it takes time to analyze separately, and keep in mind that HACCP implementation, it might take sometimes up to 2 years in some industries. So in order to conduct the hazard analysis, we need to do the following. First of all, it should include the likely occurrence of hazards and the severity of their adverse health effect. Second, to evaluate quantitatively and qualitatively the presence of hazards, because keep in mind that severity and occurrence are very important. Sometimes we can talk about hazard X, for example, the presence of let's say the peels and the tomato paste. Okay, severity wise, is it that severe? No, it's not that severe. Occurrence wise, is it highly probable to find it? Yes, it could be. So you need all the time to take into consideration these two parameters to check whether it is a CCP or not. So multiplication of microorganisms of concern, the production of toxins, chemical or physical agents, conditioning leading to the above. So the HACCP team must consider all these points. Step number 7 is to determine the CCPs. So keep in mind that every single step is a control point, but we need to make sure whether this control point is a CCP or not. To be able to do so, we will use this flow chart. So let's, or this is mainly decision tree. So it's a tree identifying the CCPs, okay? So later on, while implementing the Haccp, so we talked about the Haccp, we talked about the hazard analysis, and then every single hazard, whether physical, chemical, or biological, has to pass through this decision tree. So we need to ask these questions, okay? Just look how do we follow this tree, okay? So let's go to our example, and let's say that we are talking about pasteurization of the tomato paste, okay? Do preventive control measure exist for the pasteurization? Yes or no? Or let's say, so yes, do preventive control measure exist? Yes, we have some control measure existing because usually this tomato paste should be already safe while receiving, okay? So if yes, we continue. If no, is control at this step necessary for safety? No, not a CCP. For example, if I'm talking about tomato paste at the receiving this time, okay? Physical hazard. Do preventive control measure exist? Yes, they do exist, okay? But when we say no, if we don't have any preventive control measure, okay? For example, if I'm talking about receiving chickpeas from Argentina, do we have any control measure existing? Not really, because we rely on the what? On the COA of the supplier. So no, is control at this step necessary for safety? No, it's not a CCP. So going back to the pasteurization example, so do preventive control measure exist? Yes, we need to control the presence of, let's say, coliform. How? By the initial step, which is the receiving. Is this step specifically designed to eliminate or reduce the likely occurrence of the hazard to an acceptable level? Yes or no? So it will reduce, yes, it will reduce. It will eliminate, no, because even if we tell the supplier, please make sure that the product does not contain any kind of bacteria, but we cannot make sure that it will fully eliminate. So no. Could contamination with the identified hazard occur in excess of an acceptable level and it could increase to an unacceptable level? Yes, definitely, because if we have bacteria in the initial tomato paste, okay, and till receiving the pasteurization, we are doing some heat treatment like hot filling, but not enough time to fully remove all the bacteria. So still we can have some proliferation leading to unacceptable level. Will a subsequent step eliminate the identified hazard? So after pasteurization, do we have any other step that can remove? No, pasteurization is the last step that we remove. So no, and it is a CCP. So we will do plenty of examples in the laboratory part of the course to be more familiar with determining the CCPs. So after determining the CCPs, we should establish critical limits. So critical limits should be based on standards, for example, on pasteurization standards internationally, on FDA, on EFSA, on LIBNOR, okay? And we need to have critical limits for everything because the critical limit, okay, will separate acceptability from unacceptability. For example, let's say that the critical limit for the pasteurization of tomato paste is 85 to 90. So if we are at the 95, so it's outside the critical limit, it's non-conform. And if we are at 65, it's the same as well. So we need to put in place critical limits for everything, for moisture level, for pH, for water activity, for chlorine, and all the time we need to state the reference as well. Establishing a monitoring system. So for the pasteurization, we can have many options. Okay, so whether we can just have a look at the digital thermometer outside the tunnel pasteurizer, but this measure is not enough because it's not measuring in the core of the product. Okay, so to measure in the core of the product, we can put like an eye button, as I already explained before. So it's a button that you can insert in the core of the jar, and then you can remove it and check the fluctuation of the temperature. Okay, and we can as well have such as online monitoring system. It's a kind of a software measuring all the time the temperature, and just the quality manager can observe it. And whenever he has any kind of fluctuation, he can stop the system or the system can alarm him. Establishing corrective measures. So, for example, with respect to the pasteurization, so let's say that we measured the pasteurization and suddenly we figure out that the pasteurization within the limit. So we need to put in place a corrective action because the problem already happened and we need to avoid the recurrence. So what could be the recurrence? I think this could happen if you didn't, for example, use an I button or you didn't monitor continuously. So the corrective action could be to monitor continuously in order to deal with the avoiding the such kinds of deviation. So verification procedures, we need to make sure that the system is verified and working properly. How do we do so? By first of all, by reviewing the HACCP system and its records. So all the time we should do a kind of internal audit, okay? And all the time the quality manager should review all the records. So measuring the pasteurization is a record, the I button result is a result. He should all the time review the deviations, okay? So whenever we have zero deviation, so the system is working correctly. Whenever we don't have any kind of problems of swelling in the jars, the tomato paste jars, feedback market is necessary. If you don't have complaints, that means that the CCPs are under control. Documentation and record keeping, we should keep records for everything. So documentation, the hazard analysis, the procedures, the processes, the CCPs determination, the critical limit determination, and records. If we have any kind of deviation, we need to keep them. Some clients they try to work on this point in order to benefit from a certain discount. So again, to summarize the 7 principles of HACCP: conduct a hazard analysis, identify CCPs, establish critical limit, monitor the critical limit, establish corrective action, make procedure for everything, and establish that the system is documented. Okay, so conduct a hazard analysis. Never forget the probability and the severity. For example, if we're talking about, let's say, wheat. What is the probability to face mycotoxins in wheat? It's very high. And what is the severity? It's very severe. So it could be considered as a severe point, and we need to make sure whether to consider CCP or not by abiding by the decision tree. So decision tree is very important, but it cannot be sufficient by itself, because while determining CCPs, we need to make sure that based on history and based on updated information, this how can we solve the issue. So sometimes in some flowcharts we can have like 15 CCPs. It's not correct, it's not healthy. So the more we can reduce the CCPs, the better it is. For example, in Pepsi factory we didn't find any CCPs. Because why? Because it's a high acidic product, we have carbon dioxide protecting the product, it's a cold chain product, so no CCPs. But whenever you use pasteurization, serialization, all the time this point should be considered as CCP. Okay, and even sometimes when you use the decision tree, the decision tree can assign a certain control point as CCP. Just go back and check probability and severity, because nowadays even the HACCP is more risk analysis based wise and based on occurrence and severity. So hazards, we have 3 hazards, as you know: biological, chemical, physical. Do not forget cross-contamination. Do not forget allergens cross-contamination and microbiological cross-contamination. So biological hazards such as bacteria, viruses, parasites, yeast, and molds. Chemical hazards such as allergen, naturally occurring substances, such as intentionally adding some chemicals such as antibiotic, pesticide, herbicides, fungicides, or accidentally added chemicals such as cleaning compounds, paint, pest control chemicals. Physical. So principle to identify CCPs. CCPs are not necessarily located where the hazards occur. They can be located as a subsequent step, and some hazards cannot be controlled by the operator. So critical limit is very important. So it's the maximum and or minimum value to which a parameter must be controlled as a CCP. So for example, the CCP for chilling is 1 to 4. The CCP for the danger zone is 5 to 60. So simply it's a critical limit. It's a number. It should be a number that separates acceptability from unacceptability. The CCP of salmonella and chicken is 0. The CCP of let's say coliforms can be 100 CFU per gram. So critical limit must be clearly defined and should be measurable. I can measure them so to be able to monitor them later on. Exactly, that's what I was talking about, monitoring. So what is monitoring? So I have the CCP, I have the critical limit. Simply I need to make sure to monitor, to measure, to see whether I'm within my critical limit or I'm beyond or I'm above. So monitoring is the process of conducting a planned sequence of measurements to determine if a CCP is under control. Monitoring should be recorded and should be documented. So they show us if the critical limits are met or not met. So I need to establish a system based on a monitoring approach by scheduling, testing, and observation. And be sure that the more the monitoring is automated, the better it is because I can reduce the error margin. Establish corrective action. Corrective action should be established to avoid the recurrence of the problem. So all the way to establish a corrective action, I need to face the problem the first time to make sure how to put in place a measure enabling us to avoid the recurrence. So corrective actions are predetermined measures that have to be implemented when monitoring indicates a kind of a deviation. They must regain the control of the process. They must locate and segregate affected product. They should determine disposal of the affected product and prevent a recurrence. So usually we hold the product after facing any kind of problem in order to take the decision later on. Verification procedure. So in the verification procedure, usually we do validation and verification. So first of all, validation, we need to make sure that the Haccp plan is complete and is valid and is effective in achieving expected food safety outcomes. For example, if I'm talking about validation, so if I'm talking about temperature monitoring, validation mainly consists on making sure that the thermometers used are being valid, well calibrated, and I can compare with results from other laboratory and I can calibrate my thermometer to make it valid. Once it's valid, I can go and do the ongoing verification so I can verify my temperature. Is it within the critical limit or not? And auditing is when I make sure that I'm doing the job really on site, that I'm filling the documents, that I'm measuring, that I'm monitoring. So validation, verification, and auditing are three essential and crucial steps to make sure that the system is working properly. Establish record keeping and procedure. So it's mainly based on documentation, on archiving. It could be either soft copies or hard copies. I need to make sure that the record keeping is complete and accurate and includes all documents that I need. So guideline for the Haccp implementation system. Don't forget, assemble the Haccp team, describe your product, identify the intended use, trace your flow chart, and make sure that to verify it on site, analyze your hazards chemically, physically, biologically, determine the CCPs through using the decision tree, establish critical limit, then monitor the CCP to check whether it is within your critical limit or not. If you have any kind of deviation, put in place corrective action, then verify your procedures and don't forget to keep record and documentation. So as a summary, remember always that a Haccp system consists of two main elements: the prerequisites program, okay, the basis, and then the Haccp plans. The prerequisite program that should be implemented prior to the Haccp plan, where we control the plant environment, the GHP, the pest control, the GMP, the infrastructure. We control everything, and then the Haccp, the cleaning and sanitation procedures, and then the Haccp plan should be implemented following the PRPs. They should be tailored to a certain product or to a certain process, and they should control directly the food to make it safe. Thank you so much and hope you like this lecture.